This is part 13 of SQL Server interview questions and answers video series. In this video, we'll discuss the difference between blocking and deadlocking. This is a common SQL Server interview question. First, let's understand when blocking occurs. Blocking occurs if a transaction tries to acquire an incompatible lock on a resource that another transaction has already locked. The blocked transaction remains blocked until the blocking transaction releases the lock. The diagram here explains this scenario. We've got two transactions here, transaction 1 and transaction 2. Both of these transactions want to update this table A. Transaction 1 starts first, so it acquires an exclusive lock on the table. And at the same time, transaction 2 also wants to update the same table. So transaction 2 is blocked from acquiring an exclusive lock on that table because transaction 1 has already locked it. So transaction 2 will remain blocked until transaction 1 completes. Let's look at this in action. We'll be using these two tables, table A and table B, for this demo. And here is the SQL script to create those tables and populate them with test data. I'll have the script available on my blog in case you need it. I also have two other instances of SQL Server Management Studio here. On the left we have our first transaction, and on the right we have our second transaction. Now, both the transactions, notice that they want to update the same record in this table A. First, let's execute part of our transaction 1. Now notice I have not executed commit transaction statement, so this is an open transaction. At the same time, transaction 2 also wants to update the same record in the same table. And look at what's going to happen when we execute this transaction. This transaction, notice it still says executing query because this is blocked. This is waiting on transaction 1. And that's because transaction 1 has acquired a lock on that table, so transaction 2 is blocked from acquiring its own lock. Now, when is transaction 2 allowed to move forward? Whenever transaction 1 completes. Now look at this. When I execute this commit transaction statement, look at what's going to happen to transaction 2. Look at that, it also says query executed successfully. So when transaction 1 completed, whatever lock transaction 1 has acquired on that resource, it released that lock. So transaction 2 is allowed to acquire its own lock, and then it is able to move forward. So that's blocking. Now let's look at when a deadlock occurs. Deadlock occurs when two or more transactions have a resource locked, and each transaction requires a lock on the resource that another transaction has already locked. Neither of the transactions here can move forward as each one is waiting for the other to release the lock. In this case, SQL Server intervenes and ends the deadlock by canceling one of the transactions so the other transaction can move forward. The diagram here explains the scenario. We've got two transactions, transaction 1 and transaction 2, and we got two resources, table A and table B. Now both of these transactions want to update both the tables. So transaction 1 starts first, and it starts updating table A. So transaction 1 has already acquired an exclusive lock on table A, and at the same time transaction 2 starts, and it starts updating table B first. So at the moment, transaction 2 has acquired an exclusive lock on table B, whereas transaction 1 has acquired an exclusive lock on table A. Now transaction 1 wants to update table B, so it tries to acquire a lock on that, but it cannot because transaction 2 has already locked that table. In a similar fashion, transaction 2 tries to update table A by acquiring a lock on that. It cannot do it because transaction 1 has already locked it. So we have a deadlock situation here because transaction 1 is waiting on transaction 2 to release the lock on table B. In a similar fashion, transaction 2 is waiting on transaction 1 to release the lock on this resource table A. So neither of the transactions here are going to give up. So SQL Server intervenes and ends this deadlock by canceling one of these transactions. So for example, if the SQL Server is going to cancel this transaction, that is transaction 2, then whatever exclusive lock it has acquired on this table, that is gone. So transaction 1 is allowed to acquire a lock on that resource, and it can complete successfully, whereas transaction 2 is failed and it's rolled back. Let's look at this in action. So again, here I have two instances of SQL Server Management Studio, And here we have our first transaction, and here our second transaction. So what I'm going to do is execute part of this transaction. So we're starting our transaction 1. We executed this first update statement. It's going to update table A. Okay, so it has acquired an exclusive lock on table A. Now I'm going to execute part of our transaction 2. Transaction 2 is updating table B first. So now the situation is transaction 1 has locked table A, transaction 2 has locked table B. And now transaction 1 wants to update table B. And look at what's going to happen when I execute this second update statement. Look at that. This query is blocked because transaction 2 has already acquired a lock on table B, so transaction 1 cannot acquire a lock on that same table for that same row. And now look at what's going to happen when I execute this statement. Again, this will be blocked because transaction 1 has already acquired a lock on this table. And look at this. SQL Server has intervened, and SQL Server made this transaction 2, the deadlock victim. So it failed this transaction, and we get this 1205 error. And basically this is saying this process was deadlocked. Okay, and this is deadlocked on these resources, table A and table B. Okay, so in the case of a deadlock, there's no way that transactions can move forward. That's the reason why SQL Server intervenes and ends the deadlock by canceling one of the transactions. The transaction that SQL Server has cancelled, that's called as the deadlock victim. So that's the difference between deadlocking and blocking. They are not the same. And here is that second deadlock example that we just discussed. Thank you for listening and have a great day.